our last instruction day. So we're going to talk about Ann Case and Angus Deaton's fantastic, dispiriting work, perhaps, but it's an amazing set of results that they had. We're also going to touch a little bit on Raj Chetty's stuff. So we've done the head econ GSI bot. That was really cool. I thought, so the funny part is I didn't mute my mic, but neither did the head GSI mute his mic when he was doing the video there. So I was wondering who was shuffling papers, et cetera, in the background. It was the head GSI. It wasn't any of us, at least well, I'm not sure what you could hear from me, but that was a funny little part. Okay. Lab 13 is due tomorrow by midnight. It's meant to be kind of a warm-up. There are going to be some differences in format. So we'll have a longer timer, but I think the critical thing, if I remember right, I think I programmed it to have questions on separate pages. And instead we will have the final exam on a single page based on the feedback that we got from students about that. Let me just pull up my copy of the slide so I see what's coming here. Announcements, schedule. So let me just jump to that because I think that's probably what people are mostly interested in. So the final exam is going to be a 90-minute timed quiz, and we'll plan for it not to take a full 90 minutes. And the question is, will it be multiple choice? Yep, basically. We might have some other true-false sorts of things, but it's going to be a multiple choice exam. We'll put all the questions on one page, and the one thing I wanted to flag there is that there's going to be a timer, and it appears at the very bottom of the page, which unfortunately it doesn't seem to be something you can change in B courses. I wish we could. So what you might want to do is set your own timer and take it. Yes, another question is the quiz or the final exam going to be also open note? Yes, it will be. So open everything, and the objective is that you shouldn't really need to check your notes for some tiny little bit of minutiae. The intention is to test the general knowledge from the course. The final exam is cumulative in the sense that you need to have been paying attention and attending class and doing all the stuff the whole time. It's not cumulative in the sense that we're not going to test you on tiny little vagaries of what Thomas Piketty said or something like that. So we're not looking for small little details from the entire term, but you do need to know what the Solo model is. You need to know what the Malthusian model is. Those were both from before the midterm, and they will likely appear on the final exam as well. Are there other questions about that? I guess I should just say here what else is on the slide. So there will be a 48-hour window that you can complete the exam during any time within that window. So that should allow enough flexibility for people who have more exams on Thursday during our regular time. You also, of course, can take it and complete it during the regular time slot that we have set aside. Any questions about the final exam? All right, so we are going to have a review session. I will hold regular office hours next week. That's RRR week. And we will have a live review session during the regular class time on Thursday. I'm not going to have much to say except in response. We could do a live chat kind of thing, which people I think like to do. But I think it's best if you submit questions via this Google Forms link that I posted in announcements, and that's also right here. I think that's a better way of doing it, so then I can prepare something that's, I'll understand what you're asking, and I'll be able to prepare a better answer. But we can still try to do both of that too. Here's a question I should repeat to everybody though. So a private question submitted by a student. Do you need to review lecture material to prepare for the quiz due tomorrow, which is Lab 13? No, Lab 13 should be completely self-explanatory. You just need to do Lab 13, and chances are, provided there's enough time, and I didn't spend a lot of my effort trying to make sure that, in fact, there was enough time on it. We will test the time on the final exam itself. So Lab 13, just go ahead and do it like it's like another lab. It's not going to have a lot of material that touches stuff in the classes. Questions about any of these things? So I wanted to make sure that I polled participants. I think we have more this time. So skipping ahead now, I'm sure the administration did something weird. I think the latest thing was Mike Pence showing up to the Mayo Clinic and not wearing a mask. That was really weird. And the weirdest part was how, when asked, well, why did you do that, Mr. Vice President? And he said, well, I wanted to look the healthcare providers in the eye. And well, but you look with your eyes, right? You don't look with your mouth. I don't know. It sort of makes sense on one side of things, because I know personally, you know, this is why I like to broadcast myself here with the slides. I think you get something by looking at somebody, but he's not the one benefiting then. He's assuming that the people in the clinic were, you know, the Mayo Clinic, you know, health professionals were benefiting from seeing his face, and that's debatable, right? I don't know. It's kind of like how I don't know for sure if you're really benefiting from seeing my face, but I suspect you might be. I feel that way when I engage in these sorts of things. Actually, I should say as a side note, so yesterday I finally took part in one of our seminars, the demography brown bag. And so I was in the audience for this, and this dovetails with how you guys just wrote course evaluations, which included, if I coded it right, some questions about how this online format has been working for you. And I would imagine you're going to point out that the online format has not been working very well for you. And all I have to say is thank you for coming with me on this journey, and I'm sorry, and we are going to work on developing new ways of outreach and learning as we adapt to this. Needless to say, all of us have adapted and had to adapt very quickly. And I think, you know, the writing's on the wall about how, you know, there is a knowledge base out there about how to do distance learning. And I will be the first to admit that I did not do any of that for 175 because I didn't have the time. And I regret it, but hopefully we can still get something out of the term. I really have enjoyed office hours with students one-on-one. If you haven't come to office hours, please try to do so, or meet up with other fellow students in chat rooms or something like that around Piazza. I think that will help make this experience a little bit more normal and a little bit more useful. So here's a look. I was finally able to get this out of Zoom, and it's not easy to pull the data out, believe me, but I was able to do it. Here's a snapshot of what we saw in terms of people's geographic location back before all the wheels really came off. So we were doing distance learning starting before March 12th. I believe was our first fully distance learning Zoom meeting that day. And back then, 63% of the people who attended, and there were 90 participants, were within a mile of campus. So they were, you know, south side probably, in dorms and things like that. And some people were quite far away, but we can see that there's just, of course, been this big change, right? Of course, we were going to see that, but it's pretty staggering when you look at it, just how much movement you all have done, and I think owe yourselves a great, you know, a round of applause for yourself for all the adaptation that you've had to undertake, including the geographic movement. So with that said, why don't I open up polling here, and let's just see what it looks like today, and hopefully I can do the poll end once folks have entered the poll. I've kept the same questions then as they appeared last time, and of course I made them different from the first time, so it's always a problem of sort of running a crosswalk between these different answers that people have given, but I thought that might be interesting, especially since I believe there are more people who have made it this time, 82 participants instead of 65 last time. So we might get a slightly different result. Maybe there will be virtual reality classes instead in the future. And these sorts of things do exist. And brace yourself, of course, it usually is what's called a flipped classroom, which means that as a student, you're much more in the driver's seat. Now, it turns out that's a really good thing for educational and learning outcomes, but it's extra work, you know, anyway, be advised that that's, for example, the kind of thing we're going to look at in Econ 157 with asynchronous learning. So there'll be recorded material that students will look at it in health economics, and then the time that you spend in the classroom, so to speak, is going to be more flipped. It'll be you're more in charge as students, and that's the way to actually get people to engage a bit more. You know, and that's so obvious to me that being in a Zoom chat room like this and watching a presentation can be extraordinarily soul crushing. I hope it hasn't been soul crushing for you, but I understand if it has been. Let me go ahead and end the poll now, and let's see what we've got. End poll and share results. And there we go. And what do we see? Similar, I think, right, compared to last time. So not a ton has really changed. I'll look at it on my phone here. Yeah. 2540 was further away, but still in California, and this time it's 35. So it's slightly different, but that's the modal response, just like last time. So a lot of Californians who are back at home. Actually, for Californians, so the big story of the last 24 hours or so is that apparently the governor, we think, is now going to be ordering the Orange County beaches to be closed starting tomorrow. That's the latest that I saw on Twitter, and of course it could change very quickly. But so apparently, I think the deal is that Orange County, of course, is a very rich place, and they have great beaches. And I think the challenge, of course, is that everybody knows that there are great beaches there, and so they might be a destination, and thus people have been flocking there to the OC beaches. So I think that's the current plan, but Lord knows things can change. Yeah, so some Anirudh is saying ordering all beaches to be closed across the state, and that was the story up until about 15 minutes ago. And it may again be that it may be the case that all beaches are closed. Who knows? That if that were to happen, that seems a little draconian. That's what we were operating with, my spouse and I, and we were after class today going to take our kids to the beach because it's not May 1st yet. We'll see. Okay. All right. So let's about the same results there with geographic location. And let's see. I think I had another poll. I'm sorry for being a bit ham-handed here. Let me close this and pull up polling again. Oh, I see. There we go. I wanted to just run this again just for kicks. You can see the slide on the next page that looks at this issue and what we looked at before everything closed down on March 12th. What would you say in response to this? Income and substitution effects. Do you understand them well, kind of get them, seriously don't get them, or don't know what they are? So I admit the treatment effect that my classes and Katerina's office hours and all of our office hours may have had probably is to move folks from who said, I don't know what they are, into some other group here. And the hope, of course, is that we helped you at least kind of get them or understand them well. And if we seriously don't get them, of course, it's still sort of a problem. So these sorts of things, this actually is what a good course evaluation should probably do in some sense, right? You want to measure something that's useful. Now that's the other question, is whether you think income and substitution effects are actually useful or not. But you'd want to actually measure the competency around a particular skill or concept at two different points. And that's a good course evaluation because it measures progress or not. It is based off of a self-report. And here's the most people have voted. So let's go ahead and end the poll here. But the part of the problem is, how do you interpret, and so let me now compare. So here's our results, and let's see how we're doing. So 20, so a slight reduction in the share saying I understand them well, so maybe we confused you more, but a pretty sizable increase in the share saying I kind of get them, from 56% back on March 12th to 73% now. And nobody said I don't know what they are. So at least we succeeded on that sort of extensive margin. The intensive margin of understanding them well or not, or maybe we just confused you more. And that's arguably a problem for sure. Why are income and substitution effects even useful to think about? I guess I think about it in the following way. If you've been to fill up your car at the gas station recently, you've probably noticed that the price of gasoline has absolutely plummeted. And if you've read the newspaper, that's the serious thing. Then in and of itself, the substitution effect of a story like that, a big plummeting in the price of gas compared to just about everything else where prices haven't really changed. Now the availability of other commodities and other services especially has changed quite a bit, but the price of something, at least not on the black market, and there probably, if anything, you've seen an increase in prices, the prices have largely stayed the same. And so if you see this big reduction in gas prices, you would normally think that there'd be a big substitution effect toward purchasing more gas and using more gas and driving around some more. You also expect an income effect. So you have more real income when a price like that falls, and thus you would see a stimulated demand for gasoline, but also for everything else. And of course, this is a very unique time, right? So the basic story of demand out of the Econ 100A textbook kind of goes out the window during a pandemic and the lockdown. But that's the motivation here. Why do we care about income substitution effects? They're useful to think about, and of course they're a tongue twister. Income and substitution effects, and both of those are going to be present for a change in price, like for example a big drop in the gas price. That would also be relevant if we thought about a tax on gasoline. Now that we're talking about health economics, of course, in this part of the class, another really relevant thing is to think about what is the effect of a tax, say, on sugary or sugar sweetened beverages, SSBs, like Coca-Cola. And a tax on Coca-Cola leads to a substitution effect away from Coca-Cola, and it also is an income effect that tends to reduce your purchases of everything because a price of something, if you actually drank Coke, has risen. That's why we study them, and it looks like at least we've introduced the concept and you're aware that they're there, and that's fine. Like I said some time ago, I don't think I understood them particularly well until I became a graduate student. And that's another thing about this, of course, is that we're realistic and open-eyed about the learning objectives that we're hoping to attain here and what utility they have in people's careers and things like that. I tell you, one of the best things that happened was office hours today when a student attended and asked me about how to apply some of the concepts in the course and the general knowledge of economic demography to the things that the student was interested in. And that was magical. Ask those questions in office hours for sure. Ask them of your peers, of your GSIs, of your faculty, instructors, etc. That's a great question. So I wrote a new slide here on the takeaways from this part of the course, and there's a wordier version of this, I guess, certainly more words, that part is for sure true, in last meeting's slides and also in the previous ones. There are large inequalities in human health and mortality across socioeconomic status broadly defined. So it could be race and ethnicity, it could be income, it could be education. And these appear to be increasing over time. I'm not sure I made that point very clear, but we saw it in the video at the end of class last time. That's the paper by Raj Chetty and his many co-authors. We also see these inequalities in addition to among racial and ethnic minorities, and that's the big story with COVID-19 so far, but we also see them among middle-aged non-Hispanic whites as well. And that's the case in Deaton's contribution that we'll see today, which was just fascinating when they pointed it out. What are the implications? Well, again, the big one, I think, and this was what the brown bag the brown bag seminar yesterday was all about. It was the socioeconomic inequalities in health and impacts of COVID-19, and why the impacts might be more salient than they might normally be. It's because they're revealing these especially large inequalities between racial and ethnic groups in the United States. And I'd be interested to hear, actually, this surely is not unique to the US. We also have, well, we have a great and awful history of human slavery in this country. But it turns out that's also the case about many other countries in former colony areas in what was called the New World or the Americas. And there are many different ethnic and racial groups spread in different countries all over the world. And one thing I think that will be very interesting is to what extent the statistical reporting around the world will be able to tell us something about this. And we in the United States, at least, we have this awful history of racial inequality. We also have a good history of good measurement, which allows us to say something about these sorts of things, which is very useful. Other implications then, obvious harms to welfare, inequality and the biggest thing that matters, which is your length of life, is a real inequality. Also political instability, which I think is kind of simmering underneath the surface of the Case and Deaton stuff, that there's this great amount of hurting that appears to be happening among non-Hispanic whites. And of course, the political developments over the last 4 years seem to have indicated that there's a lot of unrest among that subpopulation. All right, so last time we ended with this, and here's the link to the article by Raj Chetty and the video that we watched. And so this was the summary slide that showed up at the end of that video. And I thought I would just quickly cover it again. Okay, continuous increases in life expectancy at age 40. So their study started there. You could talk about life expectancy in the earlier ages, but it's a little bit harder to measure that in a very large data set like they had. And what they found is that you basically always gain if you just view it as a correlational thing. People further up the income ladder were always living longer than people further down the ladder. And rather shockingly, then the wealthiest 1%, and they really mean the people with the most income, it's not a story about wealth, have a life expectancy that's at age 40 that's 10 to 15 years greater, which is a very, very large gap. They also found that the rise in life expectancy does, yeah, it's funny how it's sort of, the third bullet point is a little bit different than the first, isn't it? That the thing kind of reaches a flat of the curve, if you like, and ends at some point. That's their third bullet, which seems a little strange that somehow it doesn't. I guess they're talking about percentiles, and this is an absolute income. That's kind of the story, I guess, with the third bullet point. The expected age at death for a 40-year-old increased for people. So this is a story about changes over time. This is the widening of these inequalities in life expectancy with income. That's the fourth bullet point. Increased for people in the times that for people in the bottom income quintile. So we're talking about a gain in life expectancy during this era. So we hadn't yet seen the opioid epidemic actually reverse some of these gains, but we're talking about gains that were about maybe 0.1 year of life expectancy for each calendar year compared to about 0.25 year of life expectancy for each calendar year. And that's a 2.5 times difference, right? So 0.1 versus 0.25, pretty big. And also worrying if, what you hope is we would see some kind of convergence. Everybody gets better all together, right? That would be nice. And unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing here. Differences across geography by state and city in life expectancy at 40. And then finally, what they say is and on the next slide, I go into a little bit more of this in their paper. They're investigating why this might be the case. And what they say is the only thing that really appears to be strongly associated with the differences in life expectancy. And they're doing this with this classic ecological fallacy problem of geography. So they're looking at within a county, what's the characteristics of the county. And they're saying that the healthy behaviors on average within the county seem to be most strongly explaining in this case, better life expectancy outcomes in the county. And, so that not necessarily what is happening with people, and there could be inequality within the county, but it's what's feasible to do in any event. So here's this very busy table then out of their paper. And what they're saying is here, they're looking across counties, and they're looking at local labor market conditions in particular. So this is sort of a little bit further than halfway down the table here. Suppose you thought that what was happening was people were unemployed, and that was driving bad life expectancy results. And this in particular is in the bottom income quartile. So the bottom 25% of households by income. And what they're finding is that the association, so there's a point estimate, that's the little box, and then there's a confidence interval around that association. You generally cannot reject that the association is null or zero. Here, I guess, okay, technically a Pearson coefficient, but you could think of it as a regression coefficient as well. That's the case for many of these things. There are some departures here. So it looks like an index for social capital actually shows up as being just barely significant. So the confidence interval doesn't actually include zero, but these in particular, the unemployment rate, the change in the population, which gives you some sense of how fast the local economy is kind of growing, because it should be proportional to population change, and also the change in the labor force. None of those things seem to be associated. Instead, it's things down here at the bottom. And of course, percent immigrants, so that's associated with better life expectancy. And, you know, that's not telling us that you have more immigrants living next to you and you're healthier. Not really. It's telling us that higher percent immigrant is associated with people being healthier because it's the immigrants who are healthier. There could be some spillovers there, obviously, and there would be if we thought that infectious disease was a big part of this, but it isn't. It's actually cardiovascular disease, and it's, as we'll see with Case and Deaton, it's deaths from drug overdoses and all those fantastic things as well. So their point then, and this will come up later, we may not make it to the slide, but David Cutler is the last author of this paper by Raj Chetty and a lot of really smart people. And what he says in the Case and Deaton article, he has this very elegant highlights reel, if you like, that shows up at the end of the paper. And he comes back to this point and he says, well, what's remarkable is that it doesn't appear that the labor market really is associated a ton with this. It's the health behaviors. And here, I guess they're shown up here at the top. Current smoking, obesity, and those are of course negatively associated with life expectancy. It's the exercise rate defined in some way. I don't know what that means. The rate at which you exercise fast. I don't know. It's some reasonable measure of something that has to do with exercise. And of course you can measure exercise in a variety of ways, and some good and some a little bit better. And I imagine they've done it in some reasonable way here. So health behavior shows up. Labor market stuff does not show up. Other factors, here's median home value, which is sort of interesting. Local government expenditures, population density, percent college graduates, and those are rather strongly associated with good outcomes down there. Okay, were there any questions before I leave the Raj Chetty paper? You might wonder whether Raj Chetty is still at Stanford, and I don't know the answer to that. That guy is one of the most mobile economists you've ever seen. I'll just track his smartphone or something to figure out whether he's at Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, MIT, Stanford, Berkeley. He's at Harvard now. Yeah, he's a very mobile person. Some people do that, and I'm always astounded. I don't know what in the world happens if you have children. I'm told that if you move kids when they're little, they'll adapt. If you move them when they're in high school, they're not going to like you much. And I hope that's not a challenging thing. Maybe that won't be. The question from Xiaoguang Liang is, the ones closer to the long line are considered statistically insignificant? That's a really good question. And yes, that's correct. The ones that are closer to the long lines, the long line is at 0 for the Pearson correlation coefficient. And if this is something you might see in data 8 or your stats class, that the correlation coefficient is either between 1 or -1, and that's what's shown here. If it's 0, there's no correlation. And if the little wings on this, which are the confidence intervals around the point estimate of the correlation, include the line, if they touch the line, then you cannot reject the null. There is 0 correlation. That's the null hypothesis. Okay. Moving on. All right, so Case and Deaton, I think we're going to skip some parts of this since we have a ton of slides. And I am so grateful that they published their slides when they presented this at the Brookings Institute. And then it became this publication that we were fortunate to be able to read. So they were instrumental in identifying these key trends in mortality around age 50, and it's going to be primarily for non-Hispanic whites, but of course they look at, and you have to look at Hispanic Americans around age 50 and also African Americans around age 50 as well for comparison. The challenge there, and this arose in the seminar yesterday too, is what does one say about Asian Americans? And part of the challenge is that in these age groups, you do see Asian Americans, but it is a very heterogeneous subgroup because it'll include people who are Indian Americans and people who are Chinese and Japanese and Korean Americans. And so very different parts of Asia. Some, I think Filipinos are probably counted as being Asians as well. It kind of depends how you measure it. And so a big challenge is that the Asian subpopulation is often so small for these groups at mid-age and older in the United States that not much can be said, which is a shame. That will be changing, of course. As immigrant groups age into those ages, we'll be able to see much better what's going on. The genesis of this, though, was, to be honest, I think what it was, you know, anecdotally, I think Ann Case actually remarked that she had some joint pain from an injury or something. And I think this happens to a lot of folks who get older. I know I have felt this as I have been getting older, and I'm approaching age 50 myself. The big question now in healthcare, as you face it as you're aging, how much do you trust your doctor with pain medication prescription? And how much are you aware that doctors' incentives may not be fully aligned with your own in terms of prescribing pain medication that you can get over? You have to be able to get off the pain meds. I think that's where this maybe had come from. And I know that so famously Angus Deaton had remarked sometime earlier, several decades ago, that I think he had a hip replacement, and he was talking about the healthcare economics of it all. And he said, you know, the weirdest thing is I had a hip replacement, which is a big procedure. It's not that uncommon, but it's a big procedure. And he had no idea what the price of it was. And as an economist, not knowing what a price of something is just seems astoundingly stupid. So he may have also had some personal sense of what was important here. And then, of course, how you connect it to the broader opioid epidemic is not all that obvious anyway. So they pointed this out, that if you look at people at age 50 who are just, you know, approaching the time when their bodies start to basically depreciate in the parlance of the Grossman model. If you look at them during this period, when synthetic painkillers, opioids, were becoming more popular and were being pushed by drugs, something rather amazing emerges. And of course, it's amazing. It's also not at all a good thing, sadly. Anyway, so really smart people who came up with this, and I was very blessed to have seen them in person. So Ann Case is fantastic, and they're both tenured at Princeton. I think Angus Deaton also has got a position at USC technically. They have a new book out on the same topic, and they wrote a recent New York Times op-ed, which is a really great read, especially if you want to see them absolutely take the healthcare system to town. So the whole thing breathes fire as an op-ed maybe ought to, but it builds on, I think, this steady sort of journey they've been on recently of taking this healthcare system to task. And so this is the title and subtitle. Why don't we have a world-class health system, even though we can afford it in the United States? Our system takes from the poor and working class to generate wealth for the already wealthy. So it's a great read. And they raise a lot of very, very salient things. Here then is their slide deck that I've tried to augment so I can understand a little bit better. And I think we're going to skip some of it too, because we only have about 40 minutes left. So first we start by giving some facts. And these facts really were not particularly well known until they started to just dive into the statistics. And in particular, though, separating the statistics across different racial ethnic groups, so white, non-Hispanic versus African-American and Hispanic, that was a pretty big thing. If they can, the other thing to do is to look at white non-Hispanics with less than a high school degree. That's going to be the big, heavily impacted group here when they can measure it. And of course, the issue is that not all data sets allow you to actually measure that. It would be good if they did, and I think at least now that this research has come to light, we have some sense that in fact, you know, we should be measuring this sort of thing more often for sure. So I will attempt to do justice to the elegant way that they do this, and they look at the data and try to rule in or rule out some of the possible drivers of this kind of thing. Then we'll talk about contemporaneous circumstances, which is a story about income and to some extent employment. And then I think where we're probably going to do some skipping is the model of cumulative disadvantage and all the details that they have got in their paper there. And I should say too, the learning objectives here for you guys are to be aware that these health inequalities exist, to be aware that you can pick through data and try to make some educated guesses about what's going on when, you know, ultimately none of these things are randomized controlled trial experiments. They can't ever be. So that's the goal, I think, to be able to work with this sort of research, to discuss it intelligently, not to worry about all of the tiny details. And in particular, there's some regression analysis here that comes up in their model of cumulative disadvantage that I think will be hard for many of you, especially those who haven't had econometrics yet. But I included them in the slides because they're there. The focus here is more like revealing something that is really surprising. So sit tight and sit back, relax, and let the pilot do the flying. It's not a relaxing kind of thing, unfortunately. But so these two pictures then show that it's a story about white non-Hispanics being real outliers here. So on the left-hand side, US whites, and they're all cause mortality rates between ages 45 and 54. So here we've got males and females combined. I think by and large, it is somewhat of a male phenomenon, but not exclusively male. I think we'll get to that in a bit. So combining sexes is okay for what they want to do. And on the right-hand side, then they're looking at U.S. White non-Hispanics, WNH, in the United States. And of course, this is somewhat apples to oranges because the comparison groups here are countries, entire countries. So here's France is the top green one here. Here's Germany, the UK. We don't have New Zealand, but I think there was somebody in the chat, I think, who said that he or she or they were in the UK. So here's Great Britain. Canada, of course, is a great country compared to the United States for a variety of reasons, but it's a high immigrant receiving country. It's also, of course, nearby. Here's Australia, here's Sweden. And in all these countries, a pretty strong downward trend in the death rate for all causes. And here, what in the world is going on? Just a crazy departure there, a great divergence in this group. And you don't see it nearly as much. I wish maybe we had this. You see less of a fall overall for the United States, which is not graphed here compared to everybody else. And it's because the story is different for African Americans and Hispanics at these ages. They have not been afflicted with the same plateauing or even rising mortality rates. And in particular, then on the next slide, they point out that this is white non-Hispanics with less than high school. One of the things that's often remarked here is that not having a high school degree is a pretty rare thing, and it's becoming rarer. And that's true. They never really grapple with this. So the argument would be something like this: the share of a birth cohort that gets less than a high school degree today is probably something like 5 or 10%. It's not much. The share that gets a college degree is about a third. And there are a lot of people with just the high school degree, and some, of course, have some years of college in between and all that. But what has happened over time is that these birth cohorts have seen a far smaller share that just has high school or less. It's a fairly rare thing, but it still is out there. And I guess maybe the point is to say that you'd be surprised that there are people who don't finish high school, but they are there, and they're not in great shape, especially the white non-Hispanics. I wish there would be a way to do this for, to look at black non-Hispanics in this educational group. And I can't remember what it was. I'm going to do it again. Okay, so this red line is trending up. It's the all-cause mortality. If you look at all these other groups, you'll see the white non-Hispanics altogether is sort of a plateau story, implying then that white non-Hispanics with more than high school are seeing a decline. They get the weighted, all whites gets the two lines, the red one and the one that's not depicted, which would be the white non-Hispanics who have more than high school or more. But this is remarkable that Hispanics are seeing declines. Overall, black non-Hispanics also seeing declines in this age range, at middle age, and that's another big part of this all. So blacks remain disadvantaged, and that's what this shows you, that in these different age groups here of mortality, here's 25 to 29 in the upper left, here's 50 to 54 on the lower right. The African Americans are in the blue lines, and it's still always above the whites. But the white non-Hispanics with a high school degree or less are converging up to African American levels, which have historically been higher. There's a lot of subtlety here, right? It's not as though white non-Hispanics, I'm sorry, I think I advanced that. It's not as though white non-Hispanics are doing worse than African Americans. They are losing ground. So African Americans are still disadvantaged, right? These are very subtle points here that, there are health inequalities that disadvantage African Americans. And there also are these emerging health inequalities that are disadvantaging white non-Hispanics, especially with less than a high school degree. And I guess here on this slide, we're doing a high school degree or less, which is yet a different measure. It just shows you the challenge in trying to measure this sort of thing and pin it all down. It's often different, the different data sets here. So here now is one of the literally the smoking guns, although I think the story is not really gun violence so much, but we're looking at drug, alcohol, and suicide mortality for men and women at middle age, ages 50 to 54, compared to their counterparts in other G7 countries. And here we're not seeing a stark downward trend for anybody except I guess Germany is really winning the game here, right? They're the blue dashed line where this is clearly falling a lot, a little uptick here that I suppose, I'm trying to remember what was happening in Germany around 2002 or 3 or what exactly that was, but I think most of the economies had some kind of recession around this period. I'm trying to remember to what extent that was global. It was the tech bust in the United States. In the rest of the countries, you see sort of a flat story here, but among US whites at these ages, big increases in these, what are going to be called deaths of despair, the drug, alcohol, and suicide mortality. And then across all these different geographies, so here's a slide where what they do is they look at white non-Hispanics in this age range at middle age, and they look at that cause of mortality, again, the combination of the three of these, so drug, alcohol, and suicides. And it's happening pretty much everywhere, but in particular, what would we say there? Yeah, I think I'm just going to say it's the same. I mean, this one's a little bit different, isn't it? The large fringe MSA compared to what? These are all different measures of sort of how urban or suburban the different geographies happen to be. And I think what I would say is that this is showing, it's kind of the story for this age range for white non-Hispanics, regardless of where they are. So it's more like a story about the age and the race ethnicity that they seem to be, succumbing to this. If it were just, say, gun violence, you would think that would probably be higher in the core MSAs, in the core, urban areas, because of the potential for crime, but also, I think that's the way that works. But to be honest, I'm second guessing myself. Okay. So there are some differences across geography here. And if you look, we're looking across time. So here's 2000 in the upper left, 2007 then in the upper right, 2011 down here. And so we're kind of getting darker and darker. And in particular, it's the Southwest and the Southeast. But it's not really just a few parts. It's kind of a whole ton of parts of the United States where we're seeing these rises in drug, alcohol, and suicide mortality. A college degree is pretty good, if not perfect, protection. So compare, if you will, here, the flatness of these lines for men and women, which are showing the rates of drug, alcohol, and suicide mortality at mid-age for white non-Hispanics, but then doing it for different levels of education, and compare what we see here down at the bottom to what we saw on the previous slide a couple ago. What was this back on slide? I think it's 19. Among other G7 countries. So it looks like white non-Hispanics who have a college degree are kind of looking like, anybody else in the OECD or rich countries. It's the folks, the men and women with high school or less that seem to really be hit by this. Here's a look across different birth cohorts. So they just have this ton of data that they're marshaling to show this story. These different lines are showing for different types of mortality. So here's all together drug, alcohol, suicide up here in the upper left. Here's just drug and alcohol in the upper right. Here's suicide, lower left. Here's alcohol-related liver mortality at the lower right. And I think what we're seeing that, of the four of these, the one that looks different is this alcohol-related liver mortality. So I think their point is it's not just drinking. You might think that it could be because the real price of alcohol has fallen a ton all over the country. There's your story about income and substitution effects. If the real price of alcohol falls, you see a substitution effect toward more alcohol probably, and also an income effect that supports it because the price has fallen. But we don't see much difference across these birth cohorts in the rate at which alcohol-related liver mortality is hitting them. There are some differences here, but the way I read it is that, you know, younger birth cohorts are not being hit by this. It's really a story more about drugs and alcohol poisoning, suicides, these deaths of these deaths of despair. And then you might say, well, wait a minute, but alcohol-related liver mortality is a death of despair too. Yeah, it's true, but we've had that type of death of despair for a long, long time. And we have not had opioids that are able to do this very, very quickly without a lifetime of alcohol abuse is basically what this is showing. I think that the liver mortality is something that you have to be dedicated to a long period of your life to end up with. It's also not happening to white non-Hispanics with a college degree. So the right-hand side graph then is basically doing a version of this, of what you see on the left, but for people with a bachelor's degree or more. So on the left-hand side, less than a bachelor's, and there we've lumped in, you know, people with a high school degree, with anything else. It's just shocking, right? So, and you know, this kind of thing just makes you just exhale because, you know, we are much more safe from this than other people. We are the college educated. And this tremendous, of course, we're also talking about white non-Hispanics here, which is a minority on Econ 175, but just looking at what is happening in other strata of society is alarming for sure. And so this is another clarion call to do something about this. What in the world is happening? And so we're going to get to that shortly. Heart disease is the #1 killer. Progress for US whites is also whites with heart disease mortality. Pointing out that on the previous, and I'm seeing a pop-up that my internet is unstable. I hope I can still be heard, and I apologize for that. So I'll use my phone to call in if I have to. Let me check the chat. Oh, here's a question. Does attaining a college degree have a causal effect on health, or are these results associative? And the answer to that very good question is that I think we don't know. There is some evidence, and we talked about it last time in the Grossman model, that schooling improves health outcomes, but it's usually at lower levels of schooling, and it's not obvious to me that a college degree really causally affects health. But I will say this, that you know, we took a poll of the class, if you recall, about smoking habits, and people do vape. And also people smoke, and the overlap there was pretty significant, that some people smoke and they vape. But the overall prevalence of smoking, you know, for whatever reason, it could also be a reporting issue, was much lower among people in C175, and that's generally true about people in college. That, you know, smoking is don't tell anybody, and kids don't smoke, but smoking is fun. Drinking is also fun, don't tell anybody, and also don't drink too much and all that. But I think there are peer effects, that if you are in college, you're around peers who probably aren't also smoking. And if you're not in college, you might be spending your time with peers, perhaps at a workplace, who are smoking, for example. Here's another question. What about college educated people mostly getting health insurance with their employment? Well, that's a good point, that if you don't have a college degree, you might be more likely not to have health insurance. That's true. I'm not sure how large of an effect that is. You would have, I mean, there are people with a college degree who don't have health insurance also. It's not just relegated to that. A lot of times it's a function of age, actually. You know, famously, there was somebody my wife met in graduate school who went to work for MTV, so she was heavily educated, and they didn't give her health insurance. And that was, you know, a real tarnish on MTV, I would say. But you know, it also was a choice that person had made because they could. So I think there's something to that, but I don't know how widespread that really is. A big part of the uninsured problem in the United States is I think, a story about age. It's also a story about part-time work, but it's also in large part a story about age too. So their point here then was, it's not just external cause, it's also other things. It's not just suicides and drugs and potentially violence. And here's another question that I should probably move on, but I love these questions that you're raising. Could there be an issue of reverse causality? Yeah, if you're taking drugs heavily, you're less likely to go to college. And if you are in college and taking drugs heavily, you're probably less likely to complete it. I think that's right. But yeah, a lot of that story too is about privilege, right, and how that interacts with it all. Because you can imagine being a rather heavy drug user, but you're from a very privileged background, and your parents are fully aware that, I mean, this is George W. Bush's case. He had a bit of a problem with drugs and alcohol, and he still got through. I think it was Yale with, as they call it, the gentleman's C. He had a very low grade point average, but he completed college. So I think a lot of it probably depends on context, but I do think that a lot of it is going to be revealing your background and also, sort of the innate abilities that you're born with and probably develop in, preschool and kindergarten and K through 12. And is any of that still elastic by the time you get to college? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, don't quote me on any of that. Okay, rising mortality among middle-aged white non-Hispanics, worst in the South and the rural West. So again, the geography of this, and I guess the thing that I always like to look at the Great Plains. What's remarkable is the great differences here between say Michigan and Minnesota. To me, I think those are very remarkable. And Wisconsin is also an interesting one to compare, but Michigan really ends up being very different here. And of course, there are many stories to say about the different, say, counties here in rural Northern California there too. So there are a lot of fascinating stories one can tell. And I think I just want to keep moving ahead to some of the very clever things. Okay. Falling mortality for college-educated white non-Hispanics, rising for other educational groups. And so we've got men on the left, women on the right, and we've got these different education groups and the different trajectories. And if you're in the bachelor's degree or more, the BA or more, you're in this bottom category. You're in good shape. If you're not, if you're in the high school or less in particular, that's a real sad story. All right, so then they dive into some of the things that can be measured, and contemporaneous causes is sort of clearly referencing how you can measure income, and the problem is that it's contemporaneous with health. So what they say is that it's important, but only a part of this can seemingly be explained by the economic story, and so it leaves a lot more unexplained than it explains. And that they preliminarily conclude that, as in previous historical episodes, the changes in mortality and morbidity are only coincidentally correlated with the changes in income. Now, they later, so there's income on the one hand, there's also employment. But I think the income story, they pick it apart and say, well, there are trends in income across different groups that don't at all seem to track the different trends in mortality across these different groups. I think they would say that the trends in income then must also be somewhat disconnected from the trends in employment and marriage. So later they're going to say that it's not income maybe, but it's things like employment, marriage prospects, healthy families. It's a lack of economic despair. Those sorts of things. And so I'll try to illustrate this as we go, keeping my eye on the clock here and not getting us, hopefully, not too far in the weeds. Yeah, I was going back and forth about that. I mean, they put together this fantastic slide deck. It also takes a while to digest it, but man, they have some great graphics, like some of the best, I think, in the entire course thus far. They just laid bare, what's going on in this way that I think is very evocative of these real things that are impinging the nation and that we need to be aware of. So they see these big negative correlations between movements and income here. And so, in other words, the mortality is the red curve for, I think this is white non-Hispanics ages 50 to 54. And so mortality is the red curve, and it starts high and it goes low just as income is starting to rev up for these folks and then falling in. And they do real income here because they're measuring it over time. So they're deflating it by a CPI deflator. And then the red curve rises again just as income is going down again. And so that seems consistent with the story. And here's a similar thing then with just less fluctuations. It's more sort of like a big X. The red curve is always going down. The blue curve is always going up for ages 65 to 69 in the white non-Hispanic group. So, okay, this is one thing that might lead you to say that income matters and it's protective against mortality. But then they point this out and they say that when you look at the different income trajectories on the left and mortality trajectories on the right by education over time. So here's a BA or more is the log median real income per member of households. And there's an issue about how you measure it all, but they argue that, you know, a good way of doing this is looking at the median because it removes the big effect of the long right tail in incomes on things. And you might think that that's more meaningful. So they say here that well, suppose you have a college degree or more, it turns out that your real, the most typical or the 50th percentile of income, of your real income, seems to have basically plateaued a bunch for white non-Hispanic men and women in this age range. There's not much happening here in this red trajectory on the left-hand side, but they are benefiting from this downward trend in mortality. So that's not really consistent with the story we just saw. And the same thing is true about some college folks. They're basically plateaued in their medians here of income, and they're basically plateaued in their all-cause mortality. And the high school or less folks are basically plateaued also. There's then obviously underneath all this sort of differences, of course, in the group's weights, you know, who's who in the population here. If we see on the previous slide this big change, and here it's, you know, some you know, ins and outs, I guess, but, you know, basically a plateau here in median income for high school or less, but a big increase in their mortality. So the income story falls apart once you start looking at different groups and how they should all then be tracking in this way, and they don't. So this is a lot to absorb, but if I think I'd like you to try to take away from this very clever way of picking apart the data. All this is just associations, right? None of it's known to be causal, but sometimes all you have are the associations in the data. And what you're trying to do is see whether the pieces fit the puzzle right. And so Angus Deaton is a just brilliant person at doing this. And so is Ann Case for sure, but I've seen him do this before, and I'm sure she has done it as well, but he just does it in this amazing, just, you know, rapier sharp way of laying clear the issues. So if you believe that income lowers mortality rather, you would expect to see these curves look different. You would expect to see income rising for this college educated or more along with their mortality falling, and you just don't. So that's a learning objective if one can absorb it. It's a tough one, but to try to see what you can see in the data and test out different hypotheses that should effectively test what you really want to do, which is, you know, run an experiment, give more income to people that randomly selected and see what happens compared to a control group, which is never going to happen. Probably not anyway. I don't know. Maybe lottery winners or something. So when they look at whites and blacks, a similar challenge then that what you think you should be seeing with their incomes, if we see differences in mortality, and we do, there isn't much. There's a lot of tracking here. So the black and white experience is pretty similar. On the left, this is the high school or less, and it looks very, very similar for blacks and whites. On the right, it's black and white folks at middle age with college or more in terms of their income. And there's actually a reduction in black income relative to white income there, which is just remarkable because that is not showing up as any kind of mortality penalty for Black Americans with more education. And so that's, I think, shown here. I guess this is for all Blacks. In different groups, we could look at all Black non-Hispanics, which is the red bar here. And so they've seen these big reductions. That's what a negative number here means. It's a mortality trend over this 14-year period. And for all African-American groups, all these different age groups, we see big reductions. Now notice that this is the change in mortality, and I think there's a very hopeful story here that the historically most disadvantaged groups in the United States have been African Americans, and they have benefited strongly with reductions in mortality. It doesn't mean that the health disparities have gone away, it just means that they've benefited from the reductions in mortality. And it turns out that the groups maybe that were previously kind of on top, white non-Hispanics have maybe not seen quite the same, that perhaps their advantage has deteriorated a bit. But in this, so you might say, well, big whoop, right? the rich got less rich or something. Well, okay, that's true. But underneath it all then is this very sad story about substance abuse. And to be honest, the other thing they don't write at all about, but which is out there in the zeitgeist, the other big part of this is their votes for Donald Trump. And, an anti-immigrant, well, let's just leave it at that, I guess. You can get into a bunch of of different pronouncements there, and I'm mindful of the fact that we're closed captioning this, so I won't say anything else. All right, so then they get into a model of cumulative disadvantage here, and let me see how much we might want to do. We've got about 10 minutes or so remaining, and I don't want to beat this horse, just use an awful idiom there. I don't want to belabor a point, or I don't want to needlessly complicate things, but I think this is useful. So sciatic pain, I think I'm pronouncing it right. It's a type of pain. Medical terms are funny, Greg, because a lot of times the roots are Latin, and I never took Latin in high school or in college, and so a lot of times I'm at a disadvantage there. But sciatic pain is a particular type of pain that is associated, we don't know if it's caused, but it's associated with age, but also with obesity, occupation, being sedentary, and having diabetes. Traditionally, a lot of the things that the working classes and people with lower socioeconomic status are more impinged by. Of course, if you're like me, I've wondered a lot whether my life has become more sedentary with the coronavirus lockdowns and all that, and I think it probably has, unfortunately. But I also don't think it's going to last forever. If one looks then at the fraction that reports sciatic pain among white non-Hispanics, and you look then different birth cohorts and also split it down by educational groups. So the left-hand side folks are the folks who seem to be suffering from this, and the right-hand side folks are the people with college degrees who are not so much. So there still is a rise in age in sciatic pain. That's the Grossman model and the depreciation of health capital, right? People break down. It's certainly happening to me already. It happens. On the left-hand side, what we're seeing appears to be a big acceleration in this kind of thing happening across different birth cohorts with age. So here's the 1960 to 62 birth cohort, and they started off at a higher level. I mean, I guess the issue is we never really observed the 40 to 42 as much as we would like to, but each one of these, though, just like a cascading wave of tidal pain, right? It's tidal wave of pain that seems to be cresting up here, and that's really the scary thing. Now, people with less than a college degree may well be more likely to have occupations that get you more exposed to this. Being like a cashier or a clerk probably would, as opposed to being a manager in an office or something like that. But that's so that's I think where my mind goes anyway, and I suspect that's probably true. Leaving the labor force then is something that is more common and occurs earlier in later life among white male non-Hispanics with less than college. And that's shown here on the left-hand side, that overall the leaving the labor force, and of course the y-axis scale is a little bit different too, which kind of makes things harder to see, but leaving the labor force, probably because of this sciatic pain, which we've seen in the previous slide, is more common. And there's just this big, talk about a tidal wave of leaving the labor force here for these folks with less than a college degree. The big bugaboo with this, of course, is that it's good to retire, but I think this suggests these folks are having to retire because of health concerns, because of pain, basically. And that's a big part of the story then. And let me just skip this. Oh, never married. Okay, well, we can't skip this. I'm sorry. It's a C175, right? We're talking about marriage rates. And so here's something that just helps bring us full circle big time. Marriage rates. How could I possibly skip this? This is like one of the best parts. Marriage rates on the left among people with less than a college degree, men and women, but it's white non-Hispanics in particular. And percent of birth cohorts never married. And so this would be roughly me, the orange one. And of course, I'm actually over here presumably also orange, and I got married at about age 30, if I remember right. So this is the percent never married. So I was part of this big reduction. And that, you know, on the right-hand side, then it appears everybody is sort of proceeding toward this, you know, fairly low, but it's non-zero percent never married. But over here on the left-hand side, especially for people who are 10 years younger than me, roughly, the 1980 birth cohorts, we just seem to see this big outward shift in these schedules here, suggesting that there's just going to be less lifetime marriage overall. To be never married, of course, that means that you never get married. And there are people, of course, who could get married a ton of times. And so if you're in this group, you've never actually gotten married, if you're, and this is men and women alike, which, and of course, there are different stories there with men and women. Okay, so I'm going to skip a bunch of this, but let me just say a few things about this that, you know, I think this is compelling. It creates this very nice way of wrapping together some different strands of C175. It's child quality and child quantity to some extent. You could view is the origins of these types of things. How much education you end up having as a kid and getting as a young adult, and going into the labor force and seeing your prospects and how they evolve there. And what Case and Deaton are pointing out is that for this group that seems to be somewhat disadvantaged, and it's most obvious among white non-Hispanics because they used not to be disadvantaged. People with less than a college degree, people especially with less than a high school degree, it turns out just with less than a college degree, a big deterioration of job opportunities, and then weakening of social and economic structures. So high-paying, secure jobs, unionized jobs, started to disappear. There still are some out there. Police and fire are still unionized, some state and local government employees, and of course, teachers. Teachers, of course, are chronically underpaid. They do some of the most important work, you know, in the world, and they do not generally get paid that much. And of course, one could argue that it's because there are unions. Okay, that's possible. A big part of the issue too with teachers is that there's so much burnout early on. The system is usually set up to reward you if you can stick it out through the first several years of teaching and not lose your mind. So that's what they focus on, is that an environment, especially for these white non-Hispanics who you know, maybe came into the world expecting to see something much easier, and then they've ended up finding this, which was not, and then having this cumulative deprivation. And so I think I want to kind of cut to the chase, as they say. So there's all this stuff in there, and if you want to read it, that's fine. The story they come up with then is the slow collapse of the white working class, the people with less than a bachelor's degree. And again, you know, to exhort everybody to think about this, you know, we're doing pretty well, the college educated. It's other folks whose well-being seems to really have been impinged a lot. And of course, it's not just whites without a college degree. It's also African Americans and Hispanics generally, who still suffer from health inequalities and still suffer from, you know, labor markets that are probably not what they should be. Case and Deaton pointed this out, that this is another angle of it all. And then they talk a little bit about here, so we've got lower marriage rates and higher divorce, and also heavy prescription drug use, opioids, and deaths associated with these sorts of things. So in the time we have left, I'm going to say that you can read the other parts of the slides. I think they're really informative. I had a great time putting together or augmenting them, as it were, because of course Case and Deaton actually wrote them all for us. And then here's David Cutler's just brilliant remarks, where among other things, you know, he points out that it appears that there's not a lot in the economics that seems to be associated with the bad life expectancy outcomes that they're seeing, and that he's referring to his work with Raj Chetty and other co-authors there. And then finally, you know, this harkens to their op-ed, to Case and Deaton's op-ed. He makes this remark here at the bottom. He says, you know, it appears that, you know, the market has not been able to provide a stable income and social circumstance that people value highly enough to make them want to strive for a long life. So if the market cannot do so, maybe the government should do more. And David Cutler is not a communist. He's a very level-headed conservative economist, and you know, that's kind of where we end up. So let me just say a few things. What do we, you know, the few minutes we've got left in this term. In C175, what's important? Well, population trends are. Economic perspectives are useful there, and they're certainly not the only thing. And when you look at population science, it's clear that a lot of things are important. So Case and Deaton basically this is what David Cutler points out, that they revitalized this, Emile Durkheim thing, which is sociology. It's all part of everything that's important for sure. And of course, the joke is the good news, the economists are great at learning from others. And so I saw this on Twitter. You've probably seen this meme a billion times by now, but it's just hilarious because I won't have, the geoscience, I'm sure will tell you many instances of exactly this sort of thing happening where economists are busy explaining sociology to sociologists. And of course, now we're all on to explaining epidemiology to epidemiologists. And this is a joke, but it unfortunately, of course, is often a little bit too true. So humility, staying humble is useful, especially for economists. Prices, incomes, and choices all matter. A little econ can be a dangerous thing, and watch out for foolish economics. I can't emphasize that enough. Fight it. Fight the foolish economics because it's out there and it's stupid. Fight it. It's not good. In my humble opinion, immigration looks pretty good. I think that's the takeaway. Technological progress and cooperation will save us, and people think up ideas. Fiat lux is actually a metaphor for what evolved on Earth. It means literally, let there be light, which is the book of Genesis. But of course, that's really not the case. It's really people who evolved and then evolved the thoughts later, who are so important for development and for growth. Finally, I think what is sort of striking about where we end here is that Case and Deaton point out this declining marriage among the less educated seems to be very important. And yet, if you recall, we didn't have much to say about it at that moment in C175 when we discussed it, which is a little embarrassing, but it's also a great moment for you then, if you feel like writing a senior honors thesis or going on to further education and figuring this out, because I think it needs figuring out, and it has not been figured out very much. Finally, kids, wash your hands with baby shark. This is what came up when I Googled it, and I just thought that'd be a funny thing to end with. And so first of all, sharks don't have hands to wash. And secondly, why would they need to wash them? Because they're in the ocean. Thank you very much, everyone. Take questions if you're interested. See you next Thursday. I'll have office hours. Thank you all so very much. You owe yourselves a big round of applause for sticking with it.
Thank you.
You guys are fantastic. Cheers. See you Starside.